This is the Voice of Early Childhood podcast. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Voice of Early Childhood podcast. My name is Angelica Salinska. I'm your host, and today I'm joined by Mona Sakr. Thank you very much for joining. Brilliant to have you on.
Lovely to be here.
So Mona is Associate Professor of Early Childhood Education, and Mona and her team are researching quality provision for 0 to 2-year-olds in English nurseries. So it's really great to hear about this research as it has recently begun. So we'll be able to hear kind of the beginning of it and then hopefully also follow the progression. So I guess the kind of first question, a bit of an overview, is why is this research needed?
Well, I think we need more research about babies, full stop. And we really, really need more research about the baby room and what happens in the baby room. I think the baby room has been a forgotten part of English nurseries, for nurseries around the world, to be honest, for too long. And a big part of that is that we haven't had public money going into the baby room until now, right? So previously, it's parents putting their hands into their pockets in order to pay for the childcare for 0 to 2-year-olds. And because of that, there has been like an air around the baby room, which is that this is kind of a private domain. What happens in this space doesn't need to be as regulated as other parts of the education system. I don't think that's right, even when public money isn't going in, because we're talking about babies and babies are everybody's responsibility. But even more so in today's world where public money now is going into the baby room with this policy shift of subsidized places for 9-month-old plus, we really need to be scrutinizing and looking at what is happening in baby rooms and making sure that we're proud of what is happening in baby rooms around the country. And it's not to say that this is kind of the first ever project looking at the baby room. We're building on some amazing research, for example, by Kathy Gooch and Sasha Powell, that made a big difference to how we practice with babies. So it's not that we're kind of reinventing the wheel, but we think we really need to turn attention to what we mean by high quality provision in the baby room and develop as a sector a vision that we all feel really passionate about and that we all believe in and want to get behind delivering. And then we need to kind of translate that vision into something that policymakers can work with to support the sector to do what we want to do with babies and what's best for the babies.
So really kind of big hopes for this research and that it will influence not just practice, but policy as well to make an even bigger impact.
Huge. It's a hugely ambitious project. And, you know, we pitched the project to the Nuffield Foundation originally as a smaller project. We said we wanted to look at professionalism in the baby room. We wanted to look at the status of baby room educators within early childhood education. We were very much focused on the baby room educator as the center of the project. And Nuffield actually came back to us and said, love it, but can you make it bigger? Because actually this is a big issue, is what is just happening in the baby room and what do parents feel about it and how are the babies experiencing it? So we grew the project into something more ambitious, and we've got even bigger ambitions for the future, but more ambitious to really try and understand as a sector, what do we want to be doing in the baby room? What do we want to be achieving with the babies?
It's really great that there is funding for this because, you know, it is being recognised that it's really, really important. And obviously we as a sector understand that it is important, but often we do kind of obviously early years gets forgotten about, but then the baby room even more so, because then we think actually with 3+-year-olds, it's that school readiness element. But then with babies, it's kind of, well, they're just there, they just exist, they're not doing much. And that is the perception, I guess, in society of like, we can't really do much with babies. We just wait for them to grow into preschoolers to get them ready. And it's that kind of mindset of getting children ready for the future.
Which is just crazy, isn't it? There's such a mismatch between what we all know, and we say that we know it. We say that the first year of life is the year where the brain will do more interesting things than at any other point of your life, right? You're setting the foundations for what's going to happen for that entire person's life. Like it's huge. We know that, and we say that we know that, but then we design this education system that's completely back to front, where we're pumping in the investment and the time and the energy the older the child is, as opposed to really doing that when they are young and where we're making a massive difference. There's a awful quote, but it's so telling in Kathy Gooch's and Sasha Powell's research with baby room educators, where one educator says, well, early years is at the bottom of the education system, and we're at the bottom of the early years system. So we're just the lowest of the low. And that is so tragic when the reality is that if you work with babies, you are having more of an impact, positive or negative, on that person's life than at any other point in their educational journey. So we really need to flip the narrative and put the baby room at the center. You know, it needs to be the first thing we think about, not the last thing.
Yeah, definitely. And that really does come from the way that society views children and childhood and education as well. So you say that you are trying to gain parents' voices as well through the research?
To some extent, we've had to kind of, and this is, we had to limit our ambitions to some extent because we could go huge with
Yeah.
things and we need to keep it containable. So we're prioritizing educators' perceptions and experiences. But there is an element in where we always need to be aware of the baby in the context of the family. And some of the research that we're coming across now in our international literature review, it really stands out because very few pieces do this, but just a few do actually think about what does quality mean from the perspective of the baby and what does quality mean from the perspective of parents and carers, and where does it align with what we might see in a professional sense as being quality, and actually where is it a little bit kind of divergent, and what can we learn from those perceptions and experiences of quality. So definitely that's something we want to come back to more in the future for sure, is thinking about parents and carers and how they feel quality day to day.
Yeah, like you say, it can be an even bigger project and it's a massive project anyway.
Yeah.
So in terms of the educator perspectives, then how are you gaining their voices then? How's the research being conducted?
Yeah, so we really wanted to make this a dialogue with the sector. So rather than just going to educators and begging and pleading for their input, we wanted to offer something and then through that kind of gain experiences and perspectives. So the way that we'll do our research is through these conferences. We'll almost do a kind of road show around England where we are leading conferences specifically for baby room educators, also nursery managers interested in the baby room, also local authority advisors who work with baby rooms. But the key target audience is going to be baby room educators. And we'll host conferences that are free, baby room specific professional learning. There'll be great days out with a lovely hot lunch. And the aim is to really give something to the sector and say, look, this is a chance for us to come together. In a way that we so often don't get to do, and actually spend some time together. And in the context of that, that's when we're going to be gathering the views, the experiences, the perspectives. So we'll embed throughout those days little points where we're actually doing, quick 2-minute survey about your experiences, or a workshop that segues into a kind of focus group where we can gather some perspectives. But from the perspective of the educator, it will hopefully feel like just a seamless day of professional learning. But from our perspective, we're then able to gather all of these voices. We're aiming for more than 300 baby room educators to participate in the research so that we can actually say some meaningful things at the end about how it feels to be a baby room educator, as well as, when we know we're doing it well and what that means to us, and when it's going well and when it's not going well, what are the things that make that the case?
Hello, everyone. I'm here with an exciting announcement. The Voice of Early Childhood Conference is back again, and it will be held on 8th of February 2025. I'm really excited to share with you all the fantastic speakers and their talks. So, first up, we have Matt Baller presenting the morning keynote on proactively supporting children's mental health. Then we have 3 workshops for you to choose from out of a choice of 9 different topics and a variety of speakers. So on the leadership strand, we have Yinka Ognusi, cultivating a critical approach, targeting social justice and anti-racism. We also have Claudio Cicera and Stuart Cloak, recruiting a diverse workforce and investing in staff retention. And we have Wendy Ratcliffe, what to expect on your inspection day. And then we have our practice and parents strand. We have Dr. Sue Allingham speaking on a neuroscientific lens on the learning environment. We also have Stephanie Warrender, early literacy through song drawing. And we have Olivia Corbin-Phillip, using stories to build confidence and improve RSC. We then have our final strand, which is practice focused. From Charmaine Leach, we've got Inclusive Beginnings, Nurturing Every Child with SEND. We have Jan Dubil, Creating Your Own Curriculum. And we have Dr. Mona Sakr, Kayla Halls, and Dr. Sarah Benetti on big questions in the baby room. And then last but not least, we have Ben Kingston Hughes presenting our closing keynote all around the essential neuroscience of humor and laughter. So it's a packed agenda with lots of talks to choose from. So make sure that you grab your tickets. The link with full conference info is in this episode description. I'm looking forward to seeing you there. So it sounds like it is quite collaborative then, the way that you describe it. It's not just you coming in and doing the research on the baby room educators. It's actually them really participating. So that's that sounds like more of a community approach. It's really lovely to hear that.
Absolutely. And that's it. It's a sector-led vision. So it's not our vision. You know, the literature is flooded with researchers' perceptions of quality. Even when we're talking about the baby room, you know, we're thinking about, we've got these measurement tools, we've got the ITERs, we've got the class toddler scale, we've got these kind of worldwide, often from the US, these measures of quality, quote unquote. But actually, where does that come from? That comes from this kind of researcher top-down approach to defining quality. And we want to move away from that for 2 reasons. One, because we're just not sure how valid it is. But 2 is, how powerful, how impactful is it to really work with something that just feels like it's dropped down from the sky in terms of measuring quality and defining quality? So instead, we really want to work with the sector to create something that feels exciting, and exciting for us as a group of English nurseries. You know, looking at the New Zealand system, for example, has been really inspiring. Because they have a vision for the babies that is a New Zealand vision for the babies. And it's infused with, Maori culture and the values of New Zealander culture. And I think we need to be ambitious in England in doing that for ourselves as well, in creating a vision that genuinely makes us excited, as opposed to feeling like we've got to work with the tools and the regulatory frameworks that we've been given. So hopefully there's scope in this project to create the conditions for that.
And when you were talking about bringing in that culture aspect, it reminds me of the way that educators and researchers talk about the early years or creating early years curricula. And this really is far beyond that. It's not just creating a curriculum for baby rooms or speaking about that. It's so much more. It's the whole approach that we have to babies and educating or caring for babies.
Yeah, and they're also intertwined, those elements. You know, how do you design, if you wanted to, and even the question of, is it right to have a curriculum in the baby room is an interesting one. But if you were to design a curriculum for the baby room, where would you start from? You've got to start from a kind of pedagogical approach, and you've got to start from an understanding of, the outcomes, their particular outcomes, like the assessment, the pedagogy, the curriculum. In the baby room in particular, they're so enmeshed that I don't think you can actually necessarily separate them out. And of course, the care, so there's that lovely
Yeah.
phrase that Magda Gerber talks about, care as curriculum. So
Mhm.
actually, when we're doing a nappy change, or we're having a mealtime together, or we're putting a baby to sleep in the afternoon, those things are care, but we can actually have the imagination to see them as a kind of curriculum, that there
Mhm.
is learning happening through each of these acts. And the decisions we make about how we care are decisions we make about how we teach. They're not actually two separate things at all.
Yeah, I'm so glad that you mentioned that because that is a huge debate in early years that we're always kind of coming back to. Is it care or is it education? Is it both? And where does nurturing children come in? And I guess the baby room is that perfect space to discuss all of this because that's where we've got more of that care element that's recognized. But then the education side or the learning is forgotten about. And I guess that is what brings that, I guess, status down for baby room leaders and practitioners and generally for early years anyway.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And it's all that debate feels like it's resting on such rocky foundations to begin with, this education versus care itself is infused with this vision of education that we've had to inherit from secondary school teachers ultimately,
Yeah.
because you come into a classroom and you have your objectives and you teach this thing. And what we need to come back to is I think the phrase learning, because it has a bit less baggage. And the reality is that when you're with a baby is always learning. So you could be patting that baby to sleep. You could be changing their nappy in various ways, because we know that that's a whole spectrum of practice. However you do it, whatever you do, that baby is learning. So the question just becomes, what are they learning? Are
Mhm.
they learning that they're a competent, respected actor in this situation? Are they learning to be distracted by something else? Are they learning about what you're talking about as you're with them? Like they're
Mhm.
always learning basically. So the idea that we can focus more or less on care and learning, I don't think is quite right. I think it is right to say that actually we can get all of the elements of attachment and nurture and responsiveness in place and still be inspired to think then about our interactions and how they support different types of learning.
Mhm.
But I think we've got to see these things as really intertwined all of the time. And I think that belongs to us as early years educators, not just baby room educators, but it
Mhm.
is really definitely unavoidably the case in the baby room that care and learning are intertwined all of the time.
Mhm. And I guess maybe this is kind of like beyond this podcast episode, but what you say about babies always learning, I guess, because everything is new to them. They're very new to the world. But a debate that I've been having recently with my students is when does that learning end? So when does it become, a basic routine? And I guess you can again, like what you said, you can always bring in more to that basic routine. So you can bring in more learning. But if a child is, repetitively playing with something, for instance, to keep it basic, when do they stop learning? And I guess I'm kind of answering my question myself anyway by saying there's always more you can do.
Yes. Yeah, that's such an interesting question. And now we're getting into kind of philosophical territory of, how we define learning, because I'm not honestly sure that it ever does stop,
Mm-hmm.
because that instinct to play repetitively with something is the brain trying to solve something.
Mm-hmm.
And where is the failing, or that's too strong language, but like it's surely more on the adult's part that we just can't see. What is it that this child is trying to get at and work out through playing with this over and over again? And it might be something emotional. So there might be a stuckness that's actually some kind of like wallowing in this space
Mhm.
because it feels emotionally safe. But that in itself is a kind of learning, right? That we're learning how to comfort
Mhm.
ourselves, how to soothe ourselves through repetitive play. But it might also just be that we are doing something repetitively because there is something we're testing. And I
Mhm.
think like I'm a huge believer in babies and children, but I think like babies, I love that Alison Gopnik phrase of they're the philosopher in the crib, right?
Mhm.
That they are always asking questions through their every action that they take is a kind of question of the world. What happens when I do this? How does
Mhm.
this feel? Um, what's going to happen if I move my hand in this way? What am I reaching for? What have I found with my hand? Like it's just constant questions. And I really believe that that is a natural, innate tendency of human beings, that where it's not present or it's not visible, it will be because something is getting in the way of it, as opposed to it's not there. So
Mhm.
I think we have the joy as early years educators, definitely as baby room educators, of like working with this natural curiosity and seeing like how we can play with it ourselves and be
Mhm.
inspired by it. Because I think babies questioning is something that actually we can
We can learn from
remember. Yeah,
that.
exactly. We can remember how to do. How does it feel? You know, I was with a baby the other day in a baby room, and we were outside, and the baby fixated on the sky, and I looked to see, what are you looking at in the sky? And there was a lot going on. There were planes. Some of the babies were interested in that, but this particular baby had found the moon in the
Oh,
sky.
okay.
And I hadn't noticed that the moon was out, and it was a full moon up in the sky in the middle of the day.
Mhm.
Um, and was just looking at it and gazing at it with such wonder. And there's a lot going on, but none of it was distracting this particular baby. And for me, that was such a moment of joy and learning, because that baby was directing me to
Mhm.
look at the sky and engage with the moon and ask questions about the moon, you know, noticing that the moon rises and sets at different times every day, and that the moon is not always in the night sky. Sometimes the moon is in the day sky. And you know what I mean? It just
Mhm.
opens us up to a questioning way of being in the world and of engaging with everything around us. So I think babies actually have a lot to teach us about learning.
So I guess in us as adults reflecting on the fact that this, so for instance, the concept of the moon might be, especially in the daytime, might be completely new to the baby, then that allows us to bring in those questions because we're recognizing that the baby might or could do with asking those questions or could do with us asking and posing those questions. And then I guess demonstrating that pondering and that wondering and that curiosity
Yes.
because obviously they're not necessarily going to ask those questions and they might make the sounds, that sound like what's that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Especially if you recognize that and you know the baby. But I guess that's what you're kind of explaining in terms of, really getting the adult to question things as well
Yeah,
by
and
looking at it from the baby's perspective.
exactly, and to notice
Hmm.
what is in the world around us is such a powerful thing to do in terms of learning, to notice, to name, to ask the question. And it can happen in the moment, but it
Hmm.
can also become this kind of thread of inquiry that shapes a lot of the practice that's going on in the baby room. So it can become, actually, we're doing snuggly story time later together, and I know a book about the moon. So let's find this book and let's look at the pictures of the moon together in this book. Or hang on a second, I know a song about the moon and being under the moon's light. So there's a kind of an invitation to take these moments of fascination, because for a baby they are so often, because so much is new and the world is new and there to be explored, taking these moments of fascination, and then they grow into kind of pedagogical inquiries that bring the whole room on board.
Hmm.
I think that can really infuse a baby room with lots of love and joy. And it doesn't then feel like activities that are separate from
Yeah.
the care. In fact, it's just part of our being together is noticing things and asking questions and then finding the connections in our resources that we
Mhm.
already have.
And that's really when that care and learning intertwines, like what you were explaining earlier, giving these examples that you could really see it come to life.
Mhm.
And I'm just kind of imagining a baby room in my head, and I could just see all of that happening. But it's not that often that things like that happen. Baby rooms can, from my experience coming into baby rooms and working in baby rooms before, they can be often loud and stressful. There's
Yes.
several babies, and they're unsettled, or it can be completely the opposite and almost too quiet and without much activity going on because the babies are fine, they're kind of laying down or they're exploring, and we don't actually have to do much there. I feel like often there's either one or the other.
That's really interesting. And yeah, I think that that tallies with what I observe as well. But it's interesting, isn't it? So the first example, yes, I think often baby rooms can feel like really stressful
Mm.
environments. And the reason for that is that babies cry, and crying has a physiological stress response that it
Mhm.
triggers in us. It is designed to do that so that we tend to that baby and we make things better. It's a survival instinct to cry. And it's a survival instinct that it produces such a stress response in us. So being surrounded by babies' distress is distressing. And so that's one of the things we really need to think about with baby rooms is taking care over things like, and I really hope that this comes up in the project around quality, but around settling in.
Mhm.
Okay, settling in is a period of stress. It's a period of stress for the baby, it's a period of stress for the family, and it's a period of stress for the baby room educator. And therefore, it needs to be treated with a lot of care.
Mm.
And I think this is one area where a framework for settings may well be helpful in that some settings very carefully stagger settling in.
Mhm.
So they will have one baby settling in at a time. They will wait for that baby to be settled before another baby coming into the room.
Mhm.
Other settings do not have those kind of policies in place. And instead, what you find, I was talking to a baby room educator yesterday who'd experienced 6 babies settling into her room over a 2-week period.
Oh gosh, that is a lot.
6 babies. And she
Mm.
described the physical and psychological distress of that
Mhm.
for everybody. And I think we really need to be careful around that. And so that's the kind of the really stressful end of the baby room.
Mhm.
And that needs to be changed through the frameworks that we're given to work with. There's only so much an educator can regulate their own stress response and co-regulate with babies. They also need to be supported in a way that feels feasible and manageable. So yes, baby rooms can be really stressful places, and we need to think about that. The other thing around them being too quiet, yeah, I've seen, I think, exactly what you're describing, which is they're quite sleepy places
Mm.
sometimes,
Yeah.
almost. The light's very low, and sometimes the babies are asleep, and that's
Mhm.
great. But sometimes the babies are awake, and still the light is very low, and the voices are very low. And there's two ways of looking at that. One is to say, actually, perhaps this is exactly right. This is how it should be. It's calm, it's attuned. Maybe if we were to enter more into those interactions, we would find more going on than what immediately meets the eye. And then on the other end, I think it is really important to be aware that babies, when they have that secure base and they can rely on it, love to explore.
Mhm.
And they are naturally designed to be curious and to explore and to find novel stimulation. So we also need to be thinking around kind of like getting out and about with
Mhm.
babies. And that's something I see baby rooms often struggling with, partly because the transition to outside is often quite hard.
Mhm.
But we need to be thinking about that in relation to quality as well, actually, of what's the right balance of being in a room versus being outside, maybe in the garden, but also outside in the community,
Mm-hmm.
and getting to experience the whole world, because that's what babies really want to be doing. They want to be experiencing the whole world, not just a quiet, dim room.
Yeah. And it really makes me think that it is almost entirely up to the educators of what do we do, what like activities or interactions occur, where do we go, what happens, what learning happens, because babies aren't able to necessarily actively do as much as or kind of suggest as much as older children
Yeah.
in terms of, this is what I'm interested in, this is where I want to play. So it kind of, I question how much of the child's voice is there and that's
Hmm.
present over the adults. And obviously there is that power dynamic, but more so in the baby room, because anything that the baby will stay where it will stay if the adult places the baby there, and it can stay there all day. So I guess it's probably a lot more difficult to kind of judge that, like the interacting or interfering, and how do we move the baby? When do we go outside? When do we encourage them to play with something else? When do we put a resource out in front of them, or are they happy and settled and don't actually want anything in front of them? So I think it's,
Hmm.
as a baby room educator, there's actually so much more that you need to be aware of, in tune with, reflecting on. And as we're talking, I can kind of see how much almost like more you need to be
Yes.
educated and aware of children's development than perhaps, for 3 to 4 year olds, because they really lead their own learning and you follow that.
Yes. I mean, there's a couple of things to say there. The first is that babies will tell you when they're bored.
Yeah, that's
A
true.
3-month-old will tell you when they're bored. And will, so if a baby is kind of happily playing,
Hmm.
it's an indicator that they're engaged and
Hmm.
that they're interested and that they're learning. Again, that natural curiosity needs to be fulfilled. It is a need.
Hmm.
And so if it's satiated, it will be clear. And if it's not satiated, it will be clear. So babies are, it's tricky being with babies because what does each cry mean?
Hmm.
But
Yeah.
certainly there is a need for stimulation. It's not just a desire for stimulation, it's a need.
Hmm.
So we can tune into babies' ways of communicating around that need for stimulation. Um, yeah. The other thing I was thinking about with the baby room is that it's very much a dynamic between the baby room educator and the baby. So, whereas with the 3 and 4 year olds, we think about them as kind of discrete individuals driving their own learning, we follow their lead, and so on.
Hmm.
With babies, particularly babies under 1, where they're not mobile or they're not likely to be mobile yet, we're looking at really the dynamic between the educator and the baby. So what happens is in that relational space,
Hmm.
as opposed to the baby wanting to do this kind of learning.
Hmm.
And so there is a real emphasis then on attunement between the baby and the educator. And I'm thinking here of a term which is used in the psychological literature of mind-mindedness.
Okay.
That this is when a parent or an educator works on the basis that a baby has feelings, experiences, and thoughts, and kind of attributes through their interactions
Hmm.
an understanding and interpretation of what these thoughts and feelings might be. So it might be saying to a baby, I think you're getting a little bit restless now because I have a feeling that you're wondering what we could do outside. And what we're doing in that interaction is giving voice,
Hmm.
but in an authentic way to what we think that baby may be experiencing mentally. So we're working on the basis that they have their own mental world, and that our part of our role is to try and kind of enter into that mental world and give it some words and try things out in a respectful way on the basis of what we think might be going on for that baby.
Hmm. So it seems like there's so much more to it than just modeling language and providing that vocabulary and the running commentary. And I think what you described there is usually seen as running commentary or modeling language, and just that to learn language and to equip them. But actually there's so much more there in terms of those authentic interactions, like you say, and really tuning into the child and the child's voice. So this is why we need research like this to be able to bring all of that out and say, look how much more important this is. Yes, language is important, but it's actually so much more than that.
Yes, exactly. And that's such a good point, is that it's all relational, right? So that running commentary, you can do a running commentary in a really annoying, rubbish way that actually adds very little value to the situation, particularly with a baby, where you can just continue to natter for the sake of nattering. And it can get in the way of the magic of the moment, of connecting. It can actually stop you from engaging. But at other times, you can really authentically voice what you're noticing. So moments of fascination that you're having. Wow, you are really manipulating that object with care. Wow, you are really drawn to the whale toy, aren't you? And the whale, you like trying to make the noise that the whale makes when I make. And so there can be joy in that running commentary, but it has to come from a place of relationship. That why am I doing this commentary is because I'm in relationship with this baby and I'm trying to authentically voice something about this baby's experiences in the moment. And then the vocabulary comes from that. So, and it's a lovely example actually of that learning and care enmeshment again, right? Is that doing care? Is it learning? It's both at the same time when we're trying to authentically voice what a baby might be experiencing and what they might want or need. They're getting the vocab, of course, and they're hearing the language and they're getting all of the other learning that comes with language around facial expression and touch and so on. But they're also feeling attended to and cared about and loved ultimately. So I think, again, it's another example where in the baby room, it has to flow from that place of authentic being with, the desire to be with the babies.
I can really see how useful all of this information is for parents as well, and how much, obviously, earlier you said that it would be so much more of a bigger project if we're really involving parents as well. So I can really see the way this project already, and it's just the beginning, isn't it? What is the time frame of the research actually?
2 years. So it will go into 2026. So 2025 is our year dedicated to these conferences where we're going to be gathering baby room educators' voices. And then in 2026, we'll run a couple of workshops for the whole sector, trying to bring people together around the ideas that are emerging. And then we'll wrap up in the summer of 2026, late summer of 2026.
So it sounds like there's going to be so much rich data to unpick there. You and your team are going to be really busy that year.
Yes, absolutely. We've also made the decision that all of the conferences will be on Saturdays, just because the sector at the moment with cover and organizing cover is so tricky. So we've gone for that. And that's been a difficult decision because we also want, people's time to be valued.
Yeah.
We think that actually training on weekdays is really important, but we also want to work with the realities of the sector at the moment. So we have suddenly our diaries are full of all of these Saturdays around the country, which are going to be joyful speaking to baby room educators. But yes, it's going to feel busy and intense.
Yeah, I bet. And I totally understand what you say about events, conferences having to be run on Saturdays. That's the dilemma that I've been kind of working with over the last few years, because the feedback from my own conferences have been, we'd like it on a weekday. And then some people are like, actually, we'd like it on a weekend, and can't quite get the balance right because obviously, there's a lot to consider. And speaking of which, you and your team will be presenting, I guess, research around the project. So, presenting the research, the early kind of stages of it, just like you are now, but probably a little bit more in depth, or maybe tuning into anything a little bit more specific at the Voice of Early Childhood conference in February. And your team
we're really
will
excited.
so they'll be there as well with you.
Really excited, yeah. So it'll be myself, it will be Sarah Bonetti, it will be Kayla Hall, so the whole research team.
Mhm.
And the idea we've had is that we really want to do something quite interactive. So, yes,
Mhm.
kind of bringing in things that we're hearing in our research and things that we've gathered from our research, but really throwing them out to the floor and
Mhm.
gathering people's thoughts and experiences and perspectives, whether you're a baby room educator, an early years educator, whether you're a nursery manager. We really want to hear from people, whether you're an academic, we want to create this sector-led vision. So we've kind of put ourselves very much into listening mode
Mhm.
for everything that we're doing at the moment because we want to hear from people and gather voices. So we're hoping that people will be up for sharing with us
Yeah.
their very raw and authentic experiences of the baby room.
Yeah, I always find that, well, especially at the Voice of Early Childhood Conference, is just something that I've really kind of tried to create in terms of that community feel and collaboration, and always sparking shared reflection and shared discussions and debates. So I'm really hoping that as the years have gone by and we've seen that happening anyway this year or in 2025, it will be even more so. The delegates will be even more ready and primed for contributing and discussing as they always have been. And they've kind of been getting ready for the last 2 years, attending the conferences. So yeah, it'd be really great to have that interaction and have your whole team there as well. And what I was saying earlier as well, actually, before we kind of got onto this, is just how much impact I'm hearing that the research can have and hopefully will have. And when I was talking about parents, and I know you touched on this earlier a little bit in terms of policy, um, and influencing policy. And the research is only in at the beginning stages, I know, but obviously you do have plans for, like you mentioned earlier, um, really kind of, well, developing plans for advancing the quality of provision of the whole baby room workforce. So with this in mind, how do we ensure that research like this really does make a difference to policy specifically and not just practice?
Yeah, great point. So, and this is something we've thought about a lot, and there are kind of two strands to this for us. So the first is thinking about what do policymakers need. Policymakers are actually often very hungry for input, and
Mm-hmm.
they want to be told, this is my experience, that they want to be told a lot of the time what they should be doing, backed by evidence, but they don't need loads of persuasion. They
Mm-hmm.
want to hear, like, what is it that we could do that would actually improve things? And so we need to be really careful with this project that, yes, we create this sector led vision,
Mm-hmm.
but that the vision segues quite neatly into some kind of policy framework that a policymaker can pick up and run with particular elements of. So there will be very concrete recommendations that come out of this. So there will be a vision that the whole sector is behind, but on the basis of the vision, there might be things that we suggest regulating
Mm-hmm.
centrally. There might be things that we suggest that Ofsted need to give settings a particular steer on. So, for example, around settling in, that's just off the top of my head. It won't necessarily be there. But, that's the kind of detail that actually settings could either be advised quite strongly to
Mm-hmm.
engage with, or it can actually be regulated. And so we'll work towards a vision that in turn becomes a policy framework.
Mm-hmm.
The other avenue that we've found really helpful and fruitful is working at a local level. So it's working with local authorities, and thinking about the levers that they have access to in actually improving practice in baby rooms. Some local authorities do more than others in terms of support for nurseries, but also in terms of what they require from nurseries.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, central government decide the funding, the local authorities distribute the funding. And so, what do they require as part of that distribution of funding? It's really quite different in different areas, but we can work with local authorities to try and bake into how they work with settings certain expectations around baby rooms.
Mm-hmm.
So that might be working with local authorities to boost the training and the professional learning that they give to their baby rooms, and there are some standout local authorities that really put the emphasis on the baby room
Mm-hmm.
and have done that, again, coming back to Kathy Gooch and Sasha Powell, partly because of participation in previous research projects. And there's now a legacy of supporting baby rooms. So we can have that kind of similar, hopefully, legacy of supporting baby rooms in other local authorities. But yeah, working at that local level has also been eye-opening on other projects and something that we want to bring into this project. So right from the get-go now, we're meeting with local authority early years teams to say, this is what we're planning to do. This is the aims of our research. Where are you at the moment in terms of thinking about the baby room? And what do you need from us, or what would be helpful from us? And how can we work together in doing the research? So it's bringing in that local policy lens as well.
It's really great that you are doing this throughout the research and not just at the end, because that then prolongs the impact onto the sector. And, by the time it reaches the sector, there could have been a lot more influence and support. So yeah, it's really great to hear that. And I'm just thinking, your point, I guess, around how specific you need to be in terms of the kind of the guidelines that you bring to policymakers around your research. Do you think that potentially the lack of clarity and specificity and I guess conciseness fails us a lot of the time in communicating with policymakers? So what I mean by this is that we as a sector often I see this a lot. We say too much because we feel unheard, we over explain, and we also use language that we know and understand, but actually to the rest of the world, they don't use the same language. For instance, play versus learning is a big one.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I think there is definitely something about translating the research into the language of the audience. So when it's policymakers that we want to influence, there is a particular kind of language that they work with. And there are also lots of terms that they just won't know, and that we need to kind of, I think one of the things we've worked hard to do as a team is not get too bogged down in some of the bigger, more ideological debates that we could have, for example, around the term quality. Okay. We know that quality is a contested term, and we get why, and we're actually really on board with it being a contested term. However, when we're speaking to policymakers, we need to speak in that language of high quality provision. We need to have, Tina Bruce talks about it as bilingualism.
Okay.
Right? That we can speak different languages to different people. So when we're speaking to baby room educators, we can absolutely recognize that quality is not a stamp that we can put onto something. It's much more complicated than that. But we can also then have a conversation with a policymaker where we say, to improve the quality of what's happening, you would need to think about doing this and this and this. So that's an example of where we need to shift the language. But also in terms of the specifics then of the practice, there are some things that we need to recognize are within the kind of control of policymakers. So I'm thinking here about kind of structural quality, the way we might regulate structural quality. And there are other things that are not within their locus of control. So we're not going to get massively bogged down in sharing kind of things around baby room pedagogy with the policymaker, even though that's going to be a huge part of this project, is we're going to find out loads around the pedagogy of the baby room, and we'll share that within the sector, and we'll use it to enrich professional learning and so on. And training bodies will hear about it. And so it will have impact, but it's kind of working out for each audience, what is it that they need to hear based on what they can actually do with what they hear.
That's a really good point. Yeah. And I really love it when you talked about kind of using the right, translating the research into the language of the audience. And that is something that we definitely need to do so much more whether it is research or whether it's our kind of views and experiences as a sector. It's something that we need to be so much more mindful of. And I do think it's a skill that we need to develop as well and practice. But that awareness, I think, is important in the first place. But anyway, yeah, we've now started kind of like going too much into other avenues and like you say, really unpicking bigger issues. But yeah, I think it's probably time to wrap up this episode. So thank you very, very much for sharing your research, especially at this stage where it is just the beginning. So it's really exciting to obviously hear more as the research progresses, and I'm sure that we will hear more from you. So for everyone that is listening, Dr. Mona's article can be found on the Voice of Early Childhood website. And this article is actually written around a small-scale interview-based study which sparked this research that we were talking about. So it's interesting to kind of understand where it all came from as well. So yeah, thank you once again. And I'm really looking forward to seeing you and your team present more about this at the Voice of Early Childhood conference in February, and also just hearing more about the progression.
Lovely. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much, Angelica.